Okay, so yeah, hi Andrew, good afternoon. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Prem. Great to be with you this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like I was saying, it's really wonderful to meet people online now, especially friends who we can't meet so regularly. Now we meet each other so often online. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Sure, pleasure.
You're in Singapore now, right, Andrew?
Yes, so I'm broadcasting live from sunny Singapore.
And it's sunny Malaysia as well. It's quite a sunny day today. It's quite bright. I think it's a lovely day to go for a swim, but
Yes, that's right. It's a great day to be outside. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So Andrew, as we were chatting earlier, I was telling you over the last couple of weeks, you call it the circuit breaker in Singapore. We are calling it a lockdown here in Malaysia. It has been we have been doing a series of talks, more of creating awareness and psychoeducation, on Facebook and live talks for people who are stuck at home, on managing their compulsive disorders, on mental health and addictions. Now, as you and I know, addictions, mainly there are two big families, substance as well as behavioral disorders or behavioral addictions.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, and we were just chatting about it. How are people managing behavioral addictions like gambling or sex addictions? And the topic for today is very interesting, how much of sex is too much, right? When is it too much and when does it become a disorder? So maybe we could start off with that from you, Andrew. What are your thoughts on sex and addictions and lockdown?
Yeah, well, starting with lockdown, I think the difficulty with sex addiction is that there are certain behaviors that are not possible, or at least are highly risky, which is using sex workers, going online using Tinder and having casual sex, which can be problematic for some people. But there's plenty of pornography, and the statistics on pornographic use are absolutely amazing.
Wow.
Pornhub, I think, published something where they said they doubled their views in the last month or so. So this is, and they were having millions and millions of views a day. So this is a tremendous problem for people who struggle with sex addiction. If they aren't particularly interested in porn, then they'll go to porn as a substitute. And if they are already addicted to porn, then there are many more hours in the day that they can dedicate to their addiction. There'll be some people who have been managing it so far, but have slipped into the dark side just because of all this unstructured time that they have on their hands and the availability.
So actually what you're saying is it's pretty much similar to the gambling addiction situation as well, right? More people are now going online to do gambling, but with sex addictions, pornography has become more rampant. So are people actually realizing that pornography addiction is becoming worse, and are they coming out for help?
Yes. So just in the last 3 weeks, I've had many more new clients coming in with just sex addiction, which is a phenomenon in the addictions world. They're not vulnerable to addiction generally. They don't have the usual background, the usual comorbid mental illnesses. Rather, they're just fairly healthy, normal people with good families, good family of origin, but have got trapped into porn. So this is a very unusual group of people with addictions.
But addictions, sometimes I think it can be a little difficult. Even the DSM-5, it's difficult to define or diagnose sex. And when is too much of sex bad, for example? That's the question that I'm getting from sometimes. When do you say it's bad, or what is bad? When is sex an addiction?
Yeah, I don't think it's a very difficult question. It's the same question that you might ask of alcohol or substance abuse or gambling. The kind of criteria that the DSM uses, whether a patient has clinically significant impairment, clinically significant distress, then something needs to be addressed, and the client's coming in to see you to address it. There is a definition that has been provided now. The World Health Organization has stepped over the politicking that went on in the United States over the DSM in 2013. And they have come up with the definition in the International Classification of Diseases. So there is a definition, but practitioners have been using assessment tools, and I'm part of a group called the International Group on Trauma and Addiction Therapists, and we have a qualification called the Certified Sex Addiction Therapist qualification, and we have a tool, and it's hundreds of questions. It's 40 pages of questions which we ask clients to respond to, and we use that tool to assess sex addiction. We have a specific tool for digital media, so those people who are just obsessive about porn, they would just take that particular assessment. Otherwise, we would use the broader assessment, which is called sexual dependency inventory. So we can diagnose it to a fairly high degree, and it's based on the same kind of criteria you might see in the criteria in the DSM for alcohol use, for example.
Alcohol, yeah.
Yeah. So,
you know, Hi, Andrew, are you there?
I am, yes.
Sorry, we lost each other for a few seconds. Okay. Now, I was saying that I suppose you're right. You know, it's pretty much like diagnosing any substance addiction, and a simple answer would be, when is it bad? The answer would be when life becomes unmanageable, right? When you can't function without sex or alcohol or drugs, then it's a problem. Okay.
Exactly. We also see the same biological indicators. For example, withdrawal and tolerance. So we see those biological indicators. So it's very, very similar to alcoholism. The difference perhaps is that it's a very profound dysregulation or illness of intimacy. So the crux of it is an intimacy disorder. And whilst you may have people with alcohol use disorder who also have intimacy issues, sex is all about intimacy and the difficulties that a person might have, the stress or the dysfunction they may have around intimacy.
Okay, that's really very interesting, because I think this is something that not many people may understand what intimacy actually means, and how we relate intimacy with sex or with relationships. And why is it that some people struggle to manage this intimacy and some people can? And you said something. You said that it's quite similar to substance addictions, and you're right. I agree with you, because as we know, it's a reward system of the brain that has got a deficiency, right? That leads some people to becoming more predisposed or more vulnerable to any kind of dependency.
Right. It activates the cortico-limbic system in the same way as any other external factor might, and then has the same kind of consequences. The obsessive, compulsive thoughts and feelings are similar to someone who might be suffering from alcohol or drugs.
Well, what about intimacy, Andrew? I mean, can you share some thoughts on why is intimacy a problem, or what is it about intimacy that becomes a problem with people with sex addictions?
Well, it's a biopsychosocial disease in the same way as alcohol or substance use. So the reasons why a particular individual comes to therapy will be multiple, and they will be unique to that individual. We commonly see people who come in with trauma, for example. They may have been, the typical ACE list that you might see. With sex, you might have more people coming in with sexual abuse in their childhood. But that's just one amongst many.
Yes, and even we have seen, people with sexual addictions somewhere down the road with some psychotherapy, somewhere, yeah, I see that too. Okay, and I think one thing common with addictions, or whether it's substance or behavior, secrecy, right? Secrecy becomes a time bomb when it comes to recovery, and normally people in recovery, secrets are time bombs. So it's time to share and be honest about things. But how do you honestly share about sex addictions? That's not easy, or especially with Asians.
Yes,
With us, it's difficult.
there is a lot of shame. I'm not sure whether you can see me okay, whether your audience can see me okay. You're sort of cutting in and out, Prem. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, am I? Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah,
You're right.
and you're right.
I think we went off.
Okay, well, you're right about shame. So many people won't come into therapy because of shame. They won't go to the recovery groups like Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. They won't go to Sexaholics Anonymous. We have those two organizations here in Singapore simply because of shame. But like all people with addictions, once life becomes so difficult, their life becomes so unmanageable, they're experiencing so much pain, they're willing to do anything to try and find some relief. And so people do come in. Now, I do want to mention a group of people who are very unusual in the addictions world, and that's a group of people who are addicted to porn, internet porn, because they really don't have any of those normal characteristics, normal vulnerabilities that you'd see from people with addictions. They might come from very healthy families. They themselves might be quite healthy and running and all the rest of it. They may be doing very well in their jobs. And perhaps the only thing that shows that they have an addiction at all is the difficulty with perhaps erectile disorders or dysfunctions, ejaculation dysfunctions, things like that. But other than that, they don't really show the kinds of the characteristics you'd see of someone else in the addiction world. So that group, that just porn use group, is an ever increasing number, and they're getting extremely distressed, and life is becoming very unmanageable for them. And they're quite a different category, and they have to be treated. Interventions are somewhat different from the normal addictions person who's quite vulnerable that we would see.
Would I be right to say that the porn addictions is a growing group now, or it's an emerging group now? Yeah, and maybe more so recently with the lockdown and the circuit breaker. Would that be right to say?
Well, I think it's been an emerging group ever since the fast internet, 2001, 2002. And so we see a generation of children who are now addicted to porn, and they're in their 18, 19, 20, perhaps early 20s. And they have never had a relationship. They don't want a relationship. They're afraid of relationships. Yes. If they're heterosexual with women, if they're homosexual, then with their own sex. And there's all kinds of difficulties that they face, a lot of stress, perhaps anger and resentment, various other things that they labor under. And it's to do with pornography, which has disrupted their normal sexual development.
Definitely disrupt development, that's for sure, because we see them acting out in different, not normal ways or abnormal ways. So yeah, it definitely affects with development. How do you work with this group of people, Andrew? I mean, what's treatment like? Can we talk about treatment a little bit?
Sure. So treatment would start with an assessment. I mentioned the assessment early on. Yep. And there is a specific assessment for pornography if that's just the exclusive problem that the person's facing. I think the most important thing is to normalize it, to make sure the person who's highly anxious and highly ashamed and very worried, to assure the person that this pornographic addiction, this internet porn addiction, is prevalent, and very normal people with great families, good jobs, and so on fall into it, and that they just have their brains wired in such a way, since we all have our brains wired in a particular way, that makes us very vulnerable to porn. And I explain why. I talk about why porn is so attractive to the brain and why it creates addiction. So once they hear a kind of psychosocial model, and they're assured and it's normalized, they tend to become much more receptive to interventions. So that's really the starting point.
Sure. And I think it's very similar to what we do with substance addictions as well, isn't it? We normalize it, yeah. We let them know that it's okay because you're not alone, and it's an illness, it's a disease, basically. It's not something that you are enjoying. Well, you may enjoy it at the beginning, but after a while, it becomes a compulsive disorder or a need, right? And
yes,
normalizing is very helpful.
Yeah. Exactly, and I think the perhaps distinct from substance use and alcohol use, children get into porn inadvertently. They have friends. They're on the web doing a game that's perfectly appropriate, but then there's things that they can click on, or they accidentally click on, or that's just pushed out to them. They fall into it with greater inadvertence than, say, alcohol or drugs.
Yes.
That's quite important, because the shame that they feel has to be diffused, and it can be diffused by saying, look, it wasn't your fault that you fell into this. This was pushed out to you by Pornhub and all these other multi-billion-dollar companies who are trying to get you as viewers.
And I suppose it's more difficult for them now, because now what else can you do at home? With the lockdown and this internet speed is good speed. You get really good speed nowadays. So
exactly. Which leads me to one of the interventions, which is to load up and have parents load up the software that helps to block these sites, and also helps parents track keystrokes and sites that are visited. That's quite important for someone who comes into the clinic, that they load up those on their devices, and that they give their password to a spouse or to someone that they trust, and to delete all the material that they may have stored, if necessary, to throw away their computer, because it's quite difficult to remove things from a hard drive and replace their computer or replace their telephone. That's really one of the first things that we have to do some motivational interviewing on to get started.
Okay. What would you think? And I'm just thinking as you're talking. We just talked about kids and teenagers and young school-going kids. What do you think is the difference between the school-going kids' porn addiction and kids' porn addiction? Maybe I suppose that it will be easier for him to act it out, right? He can have partners with her. But then again, that depends able to develop a relationship, or if he's able to understand intimacy. But what do you see is different and school-going kid who's got porn addiction and adults who's got porn addiction?
So it's the
Are there any difference?
School-going children and adults, did you say?
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the porn that they look at? Yes, most probably. But I think the major differences are not so evident here in this country, but they're evident elsewhere. One is the use of cams, where it's a two-way cam, and the prostitute or the sex worker at the other end will be earning money from it. So you have to buy tokens. I have had very young clients who have stolen the grandma's credit card or the parents' credit card and run up several $1,000s that way. But it's obviously not usual, because children don't have that kind of money. The largest difference would be the use now of devices, because there are devices that can be Bluetooth synced with pornography. You buy these devices and use them as sex devices, and that's becoming extremely popular in places like Japan, Korea, the United States, and Europe. And some of those devices are quite dangerous, but in any case, they're accelerators to porn addiction. And so you wouldn't see children using those kinds of devices. You'd see children exploring things, but they wouldn't go exploring things that hook them in the same way adults might. They're not quite as conscious of their own sexual template, what really creates desire in them. They're just exploring. Whereas adults might store certain varieties, certain types, and so on of videos, and those would be accelerators to the pornographic addiction.
Well, I suppose adults are a bit more crazier than the kids, so they take more risk. Okay.
They got more money. They have more money.
Of course.
They're not more imaginative. They just have more money to. Yeah.
Wow, but that's so interesting, Andrew. That's really very interesting. I'm sorry. I've got so many questions. I know I said that we're going to have a discussion, but
All right.
you're the expert in this, and all these questions come to my mind, so I just keep throwing them away.
Sure.
So another thought's coming to my mind now. So now we talked about porn addictions. Okay, we talked about porn addictions, and then we talked about addictions with kids, school-going kids.
Yes.
And then we just discussed the difference between kids and adults with porn addictions. Now, what I'm thinking as we're talking is, so we have sex addictions. We know what are sex addictions.
Yes.
Now we talked about porn addictions. Now, would porn addictions lead to sex addictions?
It's possible. It really is very individual. It's not
Isn't
an
it?
automatic
Yeah.
thing. It's
Yeah.
not an automatic thing because they are two different things. For example, if you take the group that I mentioned, young kids, older kids who then move into adulthood, they tend to be non-relational. They would not want a face-to-face physical relationship with a woman or a man, if depending. So they're not likely to move from porn into real life. Whereas some people who get sucked into porn may see upskirting videos or videos of cameras in bathrooms and so on, see that as an idea, want to enact that out and go outside and do that, and leading to a sexual offense. And so we see that happening, the flow from internet to reality there. There are a group of people who just find porn inadequate. Just okay, they would use porn, they'd get the desire, they get bored of it, they wouldn't see that as fulfilling. So then they might go to find sex workers online, join a chat group where people talk about sex workers, or where there are sex workers, or go onto an app where they can contact a sex worker. And so then they would take the cyber world out into the real world that way. It's not an automatic correlation between porn and what happens in the real world. So it depends on the individual.
Yeah, I would have thought so as well, because we know that, as you mentioned earlier, this is biopsychosocial, right?
Yes.
So there are biological, psychological, social, even spiritual reasons. So there are 4 elements that make up a recipe for people who are becoming more predisposed, or more at high risk for becoming addicted, whether it's sex or whether it's gambling or alcohol or drugs. This is, after all, a biopsychosocial reason.
Yeah.
There are also genetic predispositions,
yes, there is.
right, as we know.
Yes. Yes, and sex addiction does run in families. We see that quite quickly. Very similar to alcoholism. Whether it's because there's a genetic or epigenetic predisposition that then interacts with the environment, or whether it's children just having this behavior normalized. Dad does this stuff, therefore I will do this stuff, or that dad has a stash and I found his secret stash and that's how I started. So we see that happening. I should go back to this point that we made at the beginning, that there are some people who are now dedicated to just using porn and masturbating and never having a relationship, and are absolutely fine with it. And that group is growing, and I have to be conscious that they're not clinically significant numbers at the moment, but they will be. But we won't see them coming into therapy because they don't have a problem. Their life is not unmanageable. They're not in distress. So that's where we use morality, perhaps, to say, well, these people ought to be going to therapy. They ought to be having relationships and getting married. But we as therapists can't go there. If someone is not distressed by using porn, and if someone is quite happy using porn and they're quite fulfilled and their lives are quite full using porn, then that's fine.
I guess that goes back to my initial question earlier, which now I should have rephrased actually. So if your life is functioning, as you just said, and if you're managing life and you're a functioning person, then why do I need help? After all, I can manage. I go to. It's just like sometimes we see alcoholics, people with alcohol addiction, and he says, "Why do I need treatment? Why did my family put me here? After all, I'm functioning, right? I pay the bills. I go to work. I just drink every day. And what's wrong with that?" So Why do I need treatment? My wife needs treatment or my husband needs treatment. I'm fine.
Well, that's different. So if someone is using porn and they have a girlfriend and they have a wife and they're not functioning well in that relationship, then yes, indeed, they do need to come into the clinic, and they often do. But if someone is single and they're happy being single, it's very interesting when you see on the internet and social media that there are these very clear groups of men, mostly men, but women as well, but mostly men. One group that believes that they're just doing their very best to get off porn. And No Fap, for example, is a website of those kinds of people who are just doing their very best. It's very much like AA for porn. Okay. And they have a lot of commitment to that, and they see a lot of damage with porn. And there's this other group who are very adamant that porn is good for them, and they all have a group and a blog and so on and so forth, talking about healthy porn use. And so, people are obviously different. If life is going fine, okay, where if you're using porn, it's the same with Tinder, because Tinder is a phenomenon, or those kinds of apps, those casual sex apps. It's very similar to that. If you're willing to take the risk of a sexually transmitted infection, you don't have a relationship at the moment, and if you do have a relationship, that relationship is very clear and open and honest that I'm on Tinder. It's fine. And there's a group of young people in their 20s who use these devices and do casual sex, and they feel that this is fine for them. And that's okay. There's nothing clinical there that we need to touch. It's only our morality that may think we need to intervene, but no, we don't, actually. But there is a group of people who are married and they're using Tinder, and it all falls apart. Their lives fall apart. And there we have to assist.
Actually, what you're saying now reminds me of, you're saying there are a group of people who think it's okay to use porn, and then there are another group of people who think, no, porn is bad, right? We should moderate it, or we should manage it. So this to me sounds like, the group of people who say cannabis use is good, cannabis is fine, it's got whatever reasons. And then we treatment providers say, no, it's an addiction, it's bad. So there are two differing views here. But I suppose...
I don't think so. I don't really think so. I think if someone is coming to you, is coming to seek help from you, then something's going wrong.
Yeah, of course.
We don't see people who don't want to be there. So,
actually, sometimes
we do
think
see people who don't. Such a mystery.
Sorry. There's a delay in the line. I was going to say, actually, we do see people who don't want to be there as well. They do. They're forced to come into treatment sometimes. Where
that's true.
Yeah. Well, I like to say that sometimes mandated treatment is still better than no treatment at all. It's treatment after all. It's not punishment. You're not thrown in jail.
Yes.
And very often, well, especially with substances, with drugs and alcohol, when the brain is affected or when they're so addicted, they don't see they have a problem, right? The brain gets hijacked by the addiction. The reward system is completely hijacked. That the rational component is not functioning, and they don't see they have a problem. I'm functioning, I'm fine, I can quit whenever I want to. And often we use the families to get them into treatment. So I suppose, mandated treatment, sometimes it's still a better option.
Okay. Yes, and with pornography, it is illegal actually in Singapore to have pornography, to download pornography or to watch pornography. But in addition to that, one of the dynamics of pornography is that after a while, you're always seeking new things, and you're seeking new things, and the people who produce this porn will lead you in this direction. They'll be sure to lead you along, and they'll lead you to things that may initially disgust you, that may be against my principles, maybe against my ethics. Perhaps there's child pornography there, and I'd be disgusted by it. But the thing about porn, and it changes the brain just the same way as drugs, is that what would initially disgust you and have you click away will remain in your mind, and the chances of you clicking back are going to be quite high. The chances of the pornographers making sure you click back by keeping you or bringing you back to the same website is quite high. And so what disgusted you initially then becomes acceptable to you. Then you end up falling down this rabbit hole. So a lot of people who watch porn are doing things illegally because they're watching the kinds of porn that are abhorred by society, quite rightly, and are illegal, quite rightly. And so they get very, very distressed by this, and quite often that's the reason they come into therapy.
Right. That actually sounds like the what we would call increase in tolerance, isn't it? When your tolerance
Yes,
level goes up, you want more and more of the same thing because you need to
yes,
get the same effect or the same impact. It doesn't, you're not getting enough of that high, or rather, that high that we say.
yeah,
So an increased tolerance, which
yes,
makes you do things at higher risk, puts you at risk.
yeah, exactly. And the industry itself is well aware and will lead you by the hand very firmly down that rabbit hole.
It's also like advertising, right? How they advertise for alcohol or smoking cigarettes. There's always something that, as you're saying, the industry will lead that. They don't want, what your brain needs, and with internet and with technology, as in gambling, how it's like they do stuff that stimulates the reward system of the brain
Yes,
to attract you to go there,
yes.
and something that was disgusting initially, can be entertaining after a while.
Yes, and I think there's an additional
Yeah,
part to porn, probably similar to gambling, that novelty. Novelty is something that our brain
yeah,
likes. And with porn,
yeah.
the novelty is endless, and the succession of images is endless. You can watch 100 people in an hour, and you can watch in all sorts of kinds of positions and camera angles and scenarios and so on. And so, unlike alcohol, which is alcohol, I mean, you can have different varieties of wine,
Yeah, yeah,
perhaps, and a different vodka, but really it's all pretty much of a muchness. Porn offers endless uniqueness and variety and novelty, and the brain gets trapped by that.
that gives you the high. Yeah, it gives you the high that the brain enjoys.
Yes, it develops the high. It gives you tolerance much faster,
Yeah,
so you can get sucked into it much quicker
yeah,
because of that variety and that endless images, endless number of images that are available out there.
wow, that's very
Well,
interesting
one of the other interesting things about porn is that it has built within it, ways of engendering fear, ways of engendering disgust, ways of engendering anger, and these emotions also feed addiction. They're
of course,
accelerators to addiction.
of course.
And so again, unlike a bottle of wine or a glass of whiskey or something, porn has this much greater potential to create compulsivity.
Wow, when you put it that way, it sounds quite scary, isn't it? I mean, that's the reality of the situation. Porn definitely has a way of
Yeah. Well,
of accelerating.
there are two other things. It's free,
Yeah,
and it's everywhere,
yeah,
ubiquitous, 24 hours.
it's
You
free.
can't say that about drugs, and you can't say that about alcohol.
Yeah, it's free. That's true. It's quite similar to when you talk about gambling. We say you chase the losses when you lose, and then you chase the winnings when you win. So that anticipation, that excitement that is created, that is constant. It's like it keeps revolving. It's non-stop, and then it just stimulates the brain so much that the brain will want it after a period of time. Anything else becomes boring. Anything else is, yeah,
Yeah,
not worth.
and that goes to a very good point. This anticipation, where the dopamine is doing its
Yeah,
thing before there's any actual satisfaction or satiation.
yeah.
This anticipation is problematic with porn because people do what's called edging. They essentially prevent themselves from orgasming so that they can watch hours and hours and
No.
hours and even damage themselves physically. And the power of that anticipation is very, very prevalent in porn, and that's what causes so much distress and indeed physical injury.
It can cause physical injury. Yeah, that's
Yes.
true. Thank you for mentioning aging, because I think that's an important thing for people to understand as well. Yeah, where you hold on to it because of that anticipation, and that gives you a high. You don't want to release it because once it's released, it's over, right? Then you wait on for the next opportunity.
Yes.
Very, very, very
Again, it's very different from alcohol and very different
Yes,
from
it
drugs. This long-term dopamine high. This constant flow of norepinephrine, constant flow of beta endorphins. It's very, very different. That makes it much more addictive.
Okay. All right. Wow, that's really interesting, Andrew. Um, I'm sorry, we were supposed to end. We have taken 5 minutes extra. So,
Okay.
because it's very interesting, we're going on and on. But I think another important thing that we should touch on on this is recovery rates. So we know it is a disease. We know it's a long thing. It's going to take a while to get better. But what are roughly the recovery rates for people who seek treatment? I suppose for people who seek treatment, what is it like, Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's like all the other addictions. If you have a comorbid condition, if you have multiple addictions, alcohol and sex addiction, which is quite a common combination. If you have multiple addictions and multiple comorbidities, perhaps other kinds of disorders, it's much more difficult. It's a long road. If you're this group that I mentioned earlier who have really no comorbid addictions, so no real vulnerability in their background, it's actually very high as long as they stick to the regimen, the recovery regimen. It's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay, we use the abstinence model of treatment, right? In Solace, and I'm sure in many places they use the abstinence model. So one common question that someone with sex addiction would ask is, so alcohol addiction, you say abstinence, fine, I quit drinking. Drug addictions, you say abstinence, fine, I quit drugging. Now, sex addictions, do I need to abstain from sex completely? Can I not have sex for the rest of my life? That's a question.
Right. Yeah, and it's a very good question. What is healthy sex for me?
What is
healthy sex for me and my partner? I mean, that's what the individual has to determine. It's very much like eating disorders. So sex addiction disorders are very, very similar to eating disorders. They even have the binge purge cycle that you might see in an eating disorder. And with eating disorders, you have to learn to eat healthily, 3 meals a day. And it's the same with sex. Healthy sex, and that generally means connected sex. But if you don't have a partner, then it means perhaps certain kinds of masturbation, not too much, for example, and not fantasizing about certain things and not using porn. So there'll be boundaries around their sexual behavior if they're single. But if it's with a couple, if they have a partner, then it's really a matter of the partner and the person finding what works for them, what can they find satisfying and fulfilling, connecting. What brings them transcendence in that union. But that's a very personal matter for each person to decide with their partner.
And I suppose this is done much better in therapy and treatment when they can work it out and identify what is the bottom line. I suppose with sex addictions and eating disorders, it's important for us to identify what is the bottom line and when, as you said, boundaries. When is it what you call a slip or a relapse, and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Of course, with sex addictions, then you need to work it with the relationship. And I think an important thing is what you said earlier, the ability to connect. We have to have that ability to connect.
Yes. So if sex is going to be healthy, then it has to be consensual. It has to be mutual. It has to be intimate. It has to build and construct and develop an intimate relationship. So that's the key. The assessment usually helps us determine whether someone who just has a pornographic addiction or an internet porn addiction, whether they can never look at it for the rest of their lives in the same way as an alcoholic. So by assessing, we can determine what might be advisable for a person. But we always, with people who are in very bad shape, we always suggest at least a 3-month period of abstinence from all sex to allow the mind to settle down, to allow the body to settle down, and to allow the relationship to start healing, or relationships to start healing. And no one died from not having sex for 3 months yet. So generally it's doable for most people.
Okay. So there is an initial abstinence period then, before you decide on your bottom line. And I suppose that's important and helpful because you need to work on allow your body to settle down and your brain to stabilize as well, and your thoughts and emotions to settle down. 90 days is always a good time frame.
Yes, and also the realization that I really don't need sex, because usually people come in inevitably thinking sex is the most important thing, the most important thing. I will die without it. And they realize after 3 months that it isn't that important to them, really.
And I didn't die.
Choose what's healthy. They can actually choose what's healthy sex after that. So 3 months abstinence is generally recommended.
Yes. It's similar with most other addictions as well. 90 days, 3 months is a good time frame to start off. It's not
Yes.
it's not a cure, but it's a good time frame to set a bottom line or a baseline or other and start off. Okay,
Exactly.
okay. Wow, Andrew, that has been very interesting actually. Thank you so much.
Good.
You know, I'm thinking you and I have had chats, we've done conferences and talks, but we've never had an opportunity to talk so much.
It's
and,
true.
isn't it? And
That's true.
this circuit breaker, this lockdown has given so many of us opportunities to connect with each other. So this is some of the good things about this whole lockdown that we're experiencing, connecting more.
But I really appreciate this opportunity, Prem, to talk to you
That's
and
a
also
pleasure.
talk to the people who are watching. And feel
It's a pleasure.
free, to send me questions and send
I
me
will do that.
responses. I'd be very happy to respond to those.
I will do that. I am seeing one or two questions coming here. Let me put
Good.
them all together, Andrew, and then I'll mail it to you or I'll send it to you, and then we can respond and put it up on Facebook.
Great.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right.
Sounds good.
Thank you again. Thank you again, Andrew, so much. You have a good
Thank
evening.
you. Thank you.
Practice healthy sex. That's the
Yes,
message we should send out to everybody.
that's the message.
Let's all practice
Thanks, Prem.
healthy sex. Thanks, Andrew, and bye bye. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.